Welcome to Blockchain Week, Day 4. Today we're going to be discussing the crypto in America, the intersection of crypto and policy in Washington, D.C. with our keynote speaker, Kristin Smith. She's the Executive Director from Blockchain Association. Take the stage, Kristin.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marilyn. It's wonderful evening here in the United States, but good morning to those of you tuning in from Australia. As Marilyn said, I'm here today to talk about crypto in America, the intersection of crypto and policy in Washington, D.C. And I can say it has been quite an adventure over the past couple of years, we have made a lot of progress in terms of closing the education gap and moving towards better policy. But just quick by way of introduction, the Blockchain Association, we are the leading trade association in Washington, focused on changing federal public policy to make it work for the emerging crypto economy that is really sort of starting to take hold this past year. We have 85 member companies that are part of our association, and these companies are all working to build out decentralized blockchains or build applications on top of them or the infrastructure to support them. They all have a presence and operations here in the United States, and they're all committed to proper regulatory compliance. We have three sort of main functions at the association. One is to create the public policy positions that we present to government for their consideration. And as I'm sure you've encountered in Australia and other places and other jurisdictions around the globe, it's not always easy to do because this is such a novel technology. We also have a communications department that works on the messaging and marketing of these ideas to the broader policymaking community. And then we have a government relations team that goes in and works with targeted policymakers in order to try to advance the positions of the association. I'm encouraged, as I've heard from some of my fellow speakers earlier in the week, that it sounds like there is crypto investment that is flowing into Australia, which is wonderful. I think that the overall narrative, it sounds like to me, in Australia is very positive. And I would say, as I said at the beginning, DC in Washington, when we're talking with policymakers, there's been a real shift, and it's a much more positive, forward-looking narrative than we've seen in years past. But I want to start for a moment and kind of just walk through some of the challenges that we've had on the public policy front here in the United States. I think the biggest one that we've faced, at least in the 3.5 years of the Blockchain Association, happened right at the end of the previous presidential administration, when the then outgoing Treasury Secretary was advancing a rulemaking that would have put significant restrictions on the ability of a hosted wallet to interact with an unhosted wallet. And what was particularly frustrating about this proposal is that it was created in the dark of night, and they were attempting to push it through without any open comment period. And we got wind that this was happening, and the community in the crypto space put in, over the Christmas holiday weekend, got about 7,000 comments into the Treasury Department. And at the association, we prepared a lawsuit, and we were actually able to hold off on that regulatory proposal moving forward. And so I think that was a real wake-up call to some companies in the United States that the crypto industry really needed to think more constructively about its engagement in Washington. But we then had a second test. This time it was in US Congress last summer in August. There was a proposal, a broad legislative proposal working its way through the US Congress on infrastructure funding. During the pandemic, this was supposed to be a way to stimulate the economy. Well, once again, in the dark of night, a provision was tucked in that broadly expanded the definition of a broker for tax reporting purposes. And this, would have made things like miners or stakers or software developers, it would put them on the hook for reporting to our tax authorities information about the transactions that they were helping to facilitate. And this was really, I think, a next level type effort from what we saw with the Mnuchin rulemaking in that we had about 40,000 phone calls that went into the US Senate in the course of 5 days. The legislation was actually held up from passage because there were amendments trying to fix this. And even though we didn't succeed in actually getting the statutory change, the political environment changed because all of a sudden, for the first time, the entire Congress understood that they had crypto constituents in their districts that cared about these issues, that were very vocal and politically active. So previously we'd been dealing with a rulemaking with a federal agency, but this time it was Congress, and the Congress is the most accountable to the people here in the United States. So those were kind of our two worst examples. Just this past January, once again, there was another sort of must-pass piece of legislation that was moving its way through the House, something called the America Competes Act. And there was once again a provision that was tucked in that was against crypto. But this time, when we went to the offices and said, whoa, 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 what are you doing? You didn't vet that with anybody, it's bad. That provision came out in 48 hours. So I think we're making progress, and particularly the US Congress is very interested in learning more about this space and trying to find the right ways to get good regulation. But it's not just Congress that has been more active and engaged in learning about crypto and thinking about crypto policy. I think what was really our sort of, what we will look back and will be one of the brightest moments of the year, was an executive order that was signed by President Biden just a few weeks ago. And this executive order was important for two reasons. The first is that it stated as a matter of public policy that it's important for the US to lead in digital assets innovation. And that is a really, really profound statement, particularly if you compare it to the previous administration that only, once sort of tweeted something about, Bitcoin being a scam or something like that. So it's very comforting for those of us working in this industry to see the President of the United States acknowledge that the work we're doing is valuable and that we want to create policies that foster that innovation here in the US. So, we're no longer in that place where there's a question about, oh gosh, is the government in the US going to ban crypto? No, they're not. They're going to find right ways to fill the regulatory gaps, but this is something that is valuable and is going to be pursued. The other thing that really excites me about the executive order is that it lays out a very thoughtful and methodical process for looking at the different public policy issues in this space. So a couple of things that the executive order highlighted included, let's look at and investigate consumer and investor protection. Let's look at financial stability, illicit finance, US leadership of the global financial system, financial inclusion, responsible innovation. These are all really important goals. These are all issues that everybody wants to see good policies around. And instead of putting out an order that said, agencies, you should go find a way to enact certain policies, this executive order asks questions on all of these areas and asks an interagency group of federal agencies to report back in 6 months with ideas on how to move forward. So I think by sort of slowing down this process, taking time to become educated, and taking time to think about what are the right solutions is a really, really good place for us to be. There's a couple of specific issue areas I want to go into that have been a focus of policymakers here in the US outside of the executive order. I think the executive order more or less captures most of these, but these are the ones that have caused the most discussion, both on Capitol Hill with the US Congress, but also with the federal agencies. And the first of those is climate policy. We saw for the first time in January a hearing in the US Congress that looked at the climate impact of Bitcoin. It was actually a very, I think, honest, open, and fair discussion. And I think that there's a lot of misconceptions that are out there, and that was a very good opportunity to start to address these narratives. But we are also seeing a lot of climate activity at the state level. We have a we have an office in New York State that focuses on state level policies. There's some legislation moving through there right now that touches upon this issue, but that seems to be kind of a major point of discussion and a really good opportunity for the industry to educate lawmakers here in DC. The second issue is stablecoin policy. This was an issue that first emerged back in 2019 when then Facebook announced their then Libra project to do a reserve-backed stablecoin. That conversation has very much evolved. We've had the Treasury Department lead a working group to come up with some proposals. They acknowledge that for anything to change in any sort of drastic way, that the US Congress would have to pass legislation. And we've seen a lot of leaders in Congress in both the House and Senate thinking thoughtfully about this. But I think that this is an example of something that started out with a very sort of uninformed, visceral reaction to the misunderstanding of the issue. But over time, the policymakers have come around and realized that reserve-backed stablecoins are very important to the ecosystem. They can be very important for the US dollar, and we want to find a way to encourage their adoption here in the US. The third issue is illicit finance, and this could be anything from anti-money laundering to countering the financing of terrorism to sanctions policy. This ties in very much with the Financial Action Task Force and the recommendations they've put out. I think those of us working in the industry in the US believe that our agency that oversees this space, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the Office of Foreign Assets Control, have really been thoughtful and forward-looking on these issues. And we don't think that there needs to be major changes, but we're always looking out for proposals that might be introduced last minute that haven't been vetted, that may have unintended consequences. And so that's something we're focused on. The fourth issue is tax policy. And there are many sort of sub-issues under the umbrella of tax, but the broker definition and who has to do information reporting is a big one. But we also have questions around the taxation of staking rewards and the taxation of lending. There's a lot of open questions that we still think we need to get some clarification on from our tax authorities here in the US. Sort of the fifth and final issue is how to deal with the regulation of crypto spot markets and whether or not securities laws apply. Unlike, I think, other jurisdictions, I'm not sure exactly how it's done in Australia, but in the US, you have a very bifurcated, or not bifurcated, like multifaceted financial regulator. And the SEC deals with the regulation of securities, but we have something called the Commodity Futures Trading Commission that deals with regulation of futures and derivatives. And crypto spot trading doesn't really fall neatly within either of their authorities. So this is something that is continuing to be discussed and debated. So where does all of this go from here? We have a lot of issues. We have a wonderful executive order process that's placed out before us. I think looking forward, regardless of what the executive order comes up with, for those of us who've been working and thinking in this space for a long time, we realize that at the federal level in the US, regulators have more or less fully exhausted any existing authority that they have to do new guidance and do regulations. The exception to that might be this IRS rulemaking, because that was just enacted into law only a few short months ago. So I think that ultimately, for the industry to get any sort of further clarity or for there to be any new level of regulation, we're going to first need legislation from the US Congress. This is a process that certainly isn't going to happen this year. We have our midterm elections where our entire House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. The Congress very soon is not going to be able to get many items, through their committees. And I think that it really won't be until 2023, 2024 that we start to see some momentum around some of the legislative ideas that have been put forth. I think that we're going to see many proposals that are introduced and circulated. And I think this is a very healthy place to be in the policymaking process, but we're certainly not going to see anything enacted or signed into law that creates a comprehensive regulatory environment for crypto in the United States. There's also this litigation factor, right? We have several major cases right now that are in the courts that are arguing over the implementation of securities laws. I would say, notably the case of the SEC and Ripple is one that the industry is following very closely. Ripple's had, some significant victories so far, but it sort of remains to be seen as to how that's going to play out. But there's also the opportunity, I think, for the industry when there is a lack of process, like we saw last year with the rulemaking on self-hosted wallets, or if new things are pushed forward that violates our First Amendment, our right to speech, and I think most of us believe code is speech. There could be some interesting litigation around that, or anything that really goes too deeply into financial privacy. I think the third-party doctrine has been, reviewed several times, in the past few years, and there's some, concern that some of the regulatory proposals out there would violate our Fourth Amendment here in the U.S. Constitution. So I think, but ideally we'd have legislation. In reality, we may get policy by litigation in the courts. That's maybe less ideal, but if it gets us, a better framework and certainty, maybe it's not that terrible of an option after all. But before I wrap up, a couple thoughts for those of you who might be new to this space or who are working for companies. I think there are a lot of ways to engage in the public policy process, and I think what applies in the US also applies in Australia or elsewhere around the globe. But I think if you're at a company or a project that's building in this space and you're small, I would very much hire a lawyer if you don't have one. And it's very, very important to have somebody that can interpret the regulations and make sure that you're complying with them. I would even extend that further and say, after you have a regulatory team, hire someone to work on public policy. I mean, there's a lot of important questions in this space. And there's a lot of education that needs to be done with policymakers. So having the right professionals on your team to deal with this is important. As a second thing you can do to participate, there are a lot of great organizations, both in the US at the Blockchain Association or in Australia with Blockchain Australia. Support these organizations that are doing work to educate the public, to bring the industry together, to facilitate dialogue. This is really important work, and these types of organizations can't exist if they don't have the support of the community behind them. But the third thing, and this applies to any individual who's passionate about this space or those working at companies, it's really important to join the conversation. And by that, I mean, participate on Twitter, on Reddit, and Discord, whatever your forum is for getting news about this space, because what's going to happen in the future is that there will be bad policies that are proposed, and we're going to need to rise up as a community to push back against those policies. And I think one of the superpowers of the crypto industry is its ability to communicate with one another, to communicate quickly, to mobilize and activate and push back when there's a proposal put forward that people don't agree with. And I think that we've seen that a couple times here now in the US, where we've been able to be very impactful, not because of the small effort of a couple of companies in this space, but because there was a broad push by multiple companies. And I think that this source of political power is ultimately what is going to lead to having good policies, because those who are in charge, who have the pen, who are writing the rules, are going to want to make sure that this community has been listened to and that their opinions are factored into the policies. So with that, I'll end, but really thank you to Blockchain Australia for having me here today. I hope you all enjoy your morning. I'm going to go enjoy my evening, but I wish everyone the best, and thank you for having me here today.